please join me now in welcoming Anita Folsom.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's obviously a pleasure to be here. Thank you for that generous introduction, Michelle. I welcome everyone, the interns, the students. If you haven't chosen a college yet, you might want to look at Hillsdale College. We're not that far from Pennsylvania. We have lots of students who come from Pennsylvania. And I thank, of course, the Heritage Foundation for being a co-sponsor of this event today. Bert and I have worked with the Heritage Foundation for years, and many of our Hillsdale College students also intern here. And I thank the Clare, Boothe, Luce Policy Institute for their kind invitation. I am indeed one of those women like Ann Romney, who was, for many years, a stay-at-home mom and never worked a day in her life. So I raised our son and was happy to do that, and I feel that we have reaped much from my opportunity to be able to do that. But at the same time, I helped Bert edit books and write books, and then we came to a time when he was going to write on, he'd already written on Franklin Roosevelt a great deal. And 3 years ago, Heritage Foundation had him here for a talk on his sixth book, which was New Deal or Raw Deal. And that was a challenge to the myth that the New Deal was successful. And if you read much on Franklin Roosevelt, if some of you students talk to your grandparents, you'll think that a halo is around the head of Franklin Roosevelt if you talk to a great many people. But Bert brought in a lot of information that really hadn't been looked at. New Deal or Raw Deal was a big hit, and the publisher, Simon & Schuster, our publisher, wanted a sequel, and Bert was concerned about writing that because military history is not his specialty. Oddly enough, it is mine. And I like military history. I've studied it quite a lot, and I like the foreign policy of the 1930s also. So we decided we could each write half of this, and FDR Goes to War was the result. And I'm very pleased that it's out and available. Now, if you think about World War II, you're roughly talking about 70 years ago. That sounds like a long time, but that's a full generation ago. 70 years ago, it was April of 1942. And on April 20th, 1942, what would Washington, D.C. have looked like, and what was in the news? Well, of course, the first thing was that the war for the United States had begun in earnest with the attack on Pearl Harbor. That occurred on December 7th, 1941. And early 1942 was a time of great disappointment in the United States. We were so unprepared for war. It was a string of defeats, a string of bad news. We had already lost Guam and Wake Island. We had 21 ships damaged in the bombing at Pearl Harbor. We lost 2,403 Americans were killed on that day. The British had already surrendered at Hong Kong and other locations, and in February they surrendered at their huge naval base at Singapore. And over 90,000 British and Indian troops went into captivity. But 70 years ago this week, there was a news event that riveted the attention of the American people, and that was that the United States forces had actually bombed the Japanese. Jimmy Doolittle's raid took place on April 18th, 1942, and it was a sensation. No one knew that we had the will and the strength and the military might to bomb Japan, and it was a secret as to how we'd done that because of course, it was a tremendously long flight, and how they did it was they put B-25 bombers, which are not very large, on an aircraft carrier and got as close to Japan as they could, and they all took off and bombed different points of Japan. They didn't do a great deal of damage, but it was a propaganda victory and important in the morale of the United States. But still, as the spring wore on, the war news wasn't good. And in June of 1942, here's what Time magazine was saying 6 months after Pearl Harbor. On the day of Pearl Harbor, Britain had already been fighting the Axis for over 33 months. Russia had been fighting for more than 5. China continuously for 59 months. At the end of 6 months, a major victory for U.S. arms is still to be recorded and more defeats are all too likely. And Time went on to say, at the end of 6 months of war, the U.S. has not taken a single inch of enemy territory, nor yet beaten the enemy in a single major battle on land, nor yet opened an offensive campaign. So our start in the war was an extremely weak one. And how did the U.S. get into this mess? How did we begin a major war and be so poorly prepared? Our men in the Philippines surrendered in April and May of 1942, and about 12,000 Americans went into captivity in that surrender. Well, we have to go a little bit further back to find out why the U.S. was in such poor shape, and for that, let's go back another 10 years to 1932. In 1932, that's 80 years ago, Franklin Roosevelt was governor of New York. He had been governor of New York since 1928, and he had decided to run for president, as a Democrat, of course. He's running against Herbert Hoover. And as a presidential candidate, Franklin Roosevelt begins to give speeches that show his philosophy of government, which is quite different from much of what's gone before. In September of 1932, he gives a speech at the Commonwealth Club in San Francisco, and here's part of what he said. He said, the government's job was, quote, to distribute wealth and products more equitably. The day of the enlightened administration has come. So Roosevelt's idea of a presidential administration is that the government is so enlightened now that it knows best and it will redistribute what people earn. When FDR entered office, he began his New Deal setting up so-called experts or czars. The czars under President Obama are certainly not new. FDR had many of them. And these experts are going to direct agriculture, banking, dam building, road building, public works of all kinds, because it is the day of the government expert, and FDR is sure they know best, and they will be able to direct the economy well. At the same time, Roosevelt uses big business as a whipping boy, as a scapegoat. The problems in the United States are caused because big business has taken advantage of the American people. Big business is full of what he calls the malefactors of wealth, who are grasping for power, and they are the problem. So he wants to regulate business more and more and more. He certainly wants to tax it heavily. And what is the result of all this? Under FDR's leadership, there's a heavy anti-business climate. And regulations multiply, taxes go up. As taxes on the rich increase, the wealthy who could have begun new business ventures don't do that. Instead, they put their money into municipal bonds, foreign investments, art collections, anywhere they can put their money so that they don't lose it to confiscatory taxes. And in the American economy, what is the overall result? Well, the result is that the depression that the United States is already in 1932, Roosevelt is elected, he assumes office. Back then, you assumed office in March. So he takes office in March of 1933, and unemployment is over 20%. We spend 8 years under Roosevelt's policies, and in late parts of 1939, unemployment is still over 20%. It's a very sad and difficult time for millions of Americans. We had boom decades from 1900 to 1910, 1920. All during the 1920s, the American economy had been growing at a rate of over 5% per year. But under Roosevelt's administration and these policies, we lose gross domestic product slightly every year. So we are in a steady decline. Very sad. For instance, there are so many regulations that businessmen feel that they have no freedom to innovate. And because what happens when you innovate? Innovation means risk. You may have an innovation that's a huge success like an iPhone, or you may have an innovation that isn't successful at all. You know, we can all think of products we've seen in the last few years that have been duds, and whatever company put money into that loses the money. And for instance, you know, there's a big war right now in the United States on telephones and what kind of phone service there will be. The iPad versus the netbook versus all of these different types of information gathering devices. Well, innovation means risk. And what happens when you discourage businessmen is they stop taking risks. They simply try to hang on until the business climate gets better. And that's what business did in the 30s. There were so many regulations, and here's a classic one, that one of the agencies that Franklin Roosevelt began, and he began hundreds of them by the time he was by his death in 1945. One of the agencies he began was the National Recovery Administration, and they're going to set prices. That meant that if you were a private business owner and you wanted to charge a certain price, very likely you couldn't do that. It was against the law. They literally set prices. One of the prices they set throughout the United States was that if you pressed pants, if you had what we would call now a dry cleaning business and you pressed pants, you had to charge 40 cents to press a pair of pants. Well, there was a pants presser in New Jersey named Jacob Maged, and he couldn't do business charging 40 cents because his shop was off the beaten path. He needed to charge only 35 cents. And he kept charging 35 cents so he could get customers. And the government officials came to him and said, "You are breaking the law. You need to charge 40 cents." And Jacob Maged said, "I'm not charging 40 cents. It's my shop. I'm going to charge 35 cents. So he continued to do that. They sent government marshals in to arrest him, threw him in jail, and fined him $100. Now that is the atmosphere that's in this country because of the policies of this administration. Eventually, some of these policies are found to be unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, but it is a fight for the entire time that Roosevelt's in office. Now, the lack of innovation extends not just to things like pressing pants or making paper clips or clothing, lots of other things, but it also extends to important defense items such as airplanes, tanks, guns. The only tank the United States had when war breaks out in Europe in 1939, now we aren't in the war at that time, is something that looks a little bit more like an armored truck. The driver had to stick his head out the top, and he signaled turns to the men underneath him by touching them on the right or left shoulder with his foot. Now that's the tank we had in 1939 when Germany had, you know, panzers by the hundreds that were racing across Europe. Innovation, the lack of innovation under FDR means also things like the helicopter. Did you know that the helicopter could have been developed back in the 30s, but it wasn't? A man named Igor Sikorsky, who was an immigrant from Kiev, settled in Connecticut and New York, and he started Sikorsky Aircraft Manufacturing. Wanted to innovate, couldn't get a lot of money in the 30s, so he doesn't start working on his helicopter until 1942, and it really isn't developed in time to play a role in the war, but it could have. Now, of course, it plays a very large role in Korea, and if you've ever seen an episode of MASH, you see the helicopters at the first of the MASH introduction, but that's because those weren't developed during World War II, and they could have and saved many lives. That's what lack of innovation does. It impedes everyone's progress. But instead, the U.S. lags behind. Our Army in 1939 is training and shooting a rifle that was designed in 1903. It's called the 1903 Springfield rifle, and it has a bolt action. Now, some of you know what a bolt action is. It means you open a bolt on the gun, insert a clip, close the bolt, and you fire one one shot at a time. It's very slow. It was very accurate, worked well in World War I, but by 1939 or 1940, it's quite out of date. What FDR had decided to do was he was going to spend money on social programs, he was going to spend money regulating U.S. society, and he was going to ignore the military, and that was popular with the American people. In 1935, the Army Chief of Staff, Douglas MacArthur, went to Congress and was pleading for a supply of bullets, enough bullets for 100,000 men for 30 days. That's how poor the Army was. So it was very, very sad. When World War II breaks out, the United States military was ranked 18th next to Holland, which is an amazing thing to think about now, but it was that poor. And we had fighting men overseas in the Philippines, on Guam, on Wake Island, and then when they're attacked, they have very little to fight with. So we have Pearl Harbor, we discussed that. We have fighting in the Philippines. We have the Navy trying to pull itself out of the mud at Pearl Harbor in the early months of 1942. And what does the U.S. at home, here in Washington, D.C., or anywhere in continental United States, what do we do in reaction to this incredible military emergency? Well, the government begins throwing up agencies, throwing up temporary buildings all over Washington, D.C., and other cities and other ports to put together a military effort that is a mad scramble. If you have toured the mall down here where the Smithsonian is now, we have all those beautiful buildings, the fountains, and all of that. Well, in 1942, they began throwing up temporary buildings that were ugly and made out of wood and tar paper, but they were designed to throw offices into to direct all of this war effort. And at the same time, we were running very, very short of manpower to direct this effort because we had been so ill prepared. There's so much that we could have done before 1941 and 42 to get ready for war, but under Franklin Roosevelt's administration it wasn't done because he didn't want to put that much power in the military. And with the manpower shortage, so then who filled all of those jobs? Well, many, many, many of them were filled by young women who had never worked before. Women's roles in 1942, I would say, changed more drastically for the first time than at any other time in American history. For one thing, up until World War II, young women were mainly expected to stay at home. They would stay at home until they married, and there were only two careers that were really open to them. If they weren't married, they could teach school or they could become a nurse. And certainly there were many women who followed those careers and did very, very well. But with World War II and with the emergency that we had and the shortage we had in manpower, because suddenly we needed the men in the military, in the Air Force, in the Navy, young women flocked to Washington, D.C. And there are all sorts of stories of how crowded the city was. Washington was not prepared for this. In 1940, it was estimated that Washington, D.C. had 15,000 outhouses because the sewer system was basically that of an older southern city. And you had many, many stately homes up and down Connecticut Avenue, DuPont Circle, out in Chevy Chase. But the back streets were very simple homes, and most of those just had privies. So suddenly the city is absolutely overwhelmed with this rush to go to war. And as hundreds of thousands of people move into Washington, D.C. For instance, the FBI was in desperate need of help in its clerical offices because all of these government workers who were working at high-priority plants were supposed to be cleared with a security check. Now, this is where you get government bureaucracy. All of these hundreds of thousands of war workers are supposed to get a security check by the FBI. The FBI offices in 1942 had files that they were so behind on, they had them stacked to the ceiling, literally in these big offices stacked to ceilings this as high as this room. And the male clerks, and many offices in Washington, D.C. before World War II used predominantly male clerks. The files were stacked to the ceiling, and the men had to get the files by going up and down ladders. Well, once the war started, the subordinates at the FBI explained to the director at that time, who was J. Edgar Hoover, and he was very traditional in his opinions about women, that women could certainly come in and help with this backlog at the FBI, but because of the ladders and the going up and down to get the files and all of this, they needed to wear trousers in the offices. And J. Edgar Hoover said he was not having women in pants in his office, so just stick with the men. And the files just kept getting bigger, and the FBI was more behind. In 1942, women for the first time began working in the Brooklyn Naval Yards, and that broke a tradition of over 140 years that only men worked in the Brooklyn Naval Yards. And what's amazing when you read the newspaper accounts of all that is the ridiculous amount of attention that went into what the women were going to wear at work. That seemed to be the big question. Were they going to wear pants at work? That was really, really considered a big deal. But we had the same questions asked then when a bill came up before Congress to begin actively recruiting women into the Army. Now, this was by stages. Now, especially some of the high school students who are here today probably don't realize, but in the 1930s, there were no women in the U.S. Army. There were no women in the U.S. Navy. There had been a women's auxiliary of sorts during World War I, but it was mostly for nursing, and they did relieve some men of duties during World War I. But in 1941, George Marshall, who was Army Chief of Staff in 1941, wanted a women's Army Corps, and he was very unusual in wanting this because it received a lot of opposition. Finally, a woman congressman from Massachusetts named Edith Rogers introduced a bill in 1941 for a women's Army Corps, and it couldn't get out of committee. It was going to be turned down, and there were all sorts of objections to this. Women were too refined to be around a bunch of soldiers. If they were drafted, what would happen to them? Would they be put into combat? If all these women lived away from their families, all they would do is all of them would get pregnant. That was one of the big arguments. So in reading all of this, it's amazing how many silly arguments come up. And what really gets women into the Army is the emergency after Pearl Harbor. After Pearl Harbor, it is such a rush to meet this crisis that finally the women's army, and even then it's just given military status yet. It's called the WAAC at first, which is Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. And that is voted through in May of 1942. And the first director is a woman. She's not really even given rank at first. She's called a director, and her name is Ovida Culp. She's the wife of a politician. She's sworn in. She's a mother of two, and she looks every inch the lady in the photos. She has this big hat on, gloves, and she's sworn in as the head of the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps. And was quite a good leader, though. The first bill for the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps they were only going to have 25,000 women. Now, this is quite different from the policy already adopted by Great Britain. If you follow the history of Great Britain had such a military emergency by the 1940s that they were taking every woman they could find. And in fact, if you were a young woman age 18 or older and you weren't married, you had to serve in what they called national service. And if you look into the history of, for instance, Queen Elizabeth II, who is still Queen of England, she served in the National Women's Service Organization in Great Britain and drove a truck. And you technically weren't in the Army, but they took 18-year-old women and gave them jobs. You could either go into a military job or a factory job building weapons. The United States never took that particular step, but just getting a women's Army Corps up and going proved to be a major hurdle, and it was accomplished in 1942. Eventually, the women are given full military status. They are officers or enlisted. They are entitled to benefits. They get the same benefits as the men do. They don't get the same pay. But they have to get the Women's Army Corps up and going in the summer of 42 as all these military emergencies are going on, and reporters flock to the bases where they're sent. They begin out in Iowa. They've turned that base into a women's army camp. And again, the main thing the reporters want to know is, what are the uniforms going to look like? They don't ask any substantive questions at all. One of the big questions is, will the women wear girdles? That seems to be a big topic, and it's really silly. But the women have to prove that they can do the work, and they do. And not only in the Women's Army Corps, at that time the Women's Nursing Corps was separate. Thousands of American women serve all over the world as nurses for the Army. So a very illustrious history. Also in 42, something that begins to happen with so many of the men going into the military is many more women run for a political office. And one of those women is Clare Boothe Luce. She lives in Connecticut. She runs for Congress for the first time in her life, and she's elected in the fall of 1942 to Congress and serves all during the war. So we have all of those changes going on in American society. 1942 is a year of tremendous upheaval, and if you want to know more about it, I do encourage you to read our book. And one of the biggest upheavals that actually takes place during World War II, and as someone has said, don't ever waste a good emergency, and that is in the area of the federal income tax. In 1940, only 5% of Americans paid any income tax at all, and those were mostly wealthier Americans. But Franklin Roosevelt, for decades, has wanted to institute an income tax that will get to almost everyone. He wants the federal government to have the money to redistribute and to use, in essence, to put Democrats on the rolls and keep winning elections. That's his plan. So with the war emergency, he's able to push through Congress a bill for something that sounds so innocent. It was called pay-as-you-go. If you ever are reading a newspaper in 1942 and they talk about pay-as-you-go, that is withholding. They had in 1942, we still did not have a system where people's pay envelopes, where they lost part of their pay every week in deductions. What happened was you worked all year and you paid your taxes at the end of the year. And the good thing about that is you get the full impact of paying taxes. But at the end of the year, you think, I worked and I have to give this money to the government. It's a very large impact. But pay-as-you-go was actually the idea of, I'm sorry to say, a college professor who said that will go down a lot easier, and he was right. It passed in 1943. They began what we would call withholding. And suddenly the government has an entree into much more money. And by 1944, 65% of all Americans are paying income tax. It's absolutely a fundamental shift in the role of government and the size of government. That happens during World War II. So we see all of these changes, and they shouldn't have been a surprise to anyone, because Franklin Roosevelt, in that speech in 1932, 80 years ago, in his Commonwealth Club speech, he lined out what he was going to do. He said we need to redistribute wealth, and it is government's job to direct the economy. And by the end of World War II, that is indeed what had happened. Thank you very much.
What an interesting discussion. I learned some things I thought I knew, but that's excellent. Think about trousers. I didn't know about that, but I guess it makes sense back then. A lady wore a dress.
Yes, a
Period.
lady always wore a dress.
Yeah.
Always.
Well, Anita has agreed to take a few questions. If you would not mind, I'll let you call on people.
Sure.
And just wait until the mic comes so that the people watching this on the film will be able to hear your question. If you wouldn't mind, give your name and your affiliation, and we'll spend a little bit of time on questions. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Does anyone have a question? Any of our high school guests, feel free.
Frida Hugley, a member of a Republican Women's Club. If the war hadn't come along, what would have happened to our economy, do you think?
That's an interesting question. If the war hadn't happened, what would have happened to the economy? In 1938 and 1939, many people don't realize Franklin Roosevelt had lost a lot of clout with Congress. He had really angered the American people. Part of what had happened was I mentioned the price fixing that went on under the NRA, and he had tried all these regulations with government. And the Supreme Court began to strike those down. Well, Franklin Roosevelt was very angry with the Supreme Court. So in 1936 and 37 and 38, he tried what was called court packing. He wanted to change the size of the Supreme Court to 15 justices. And the excuse he used was that they were just so overworked with only 9, they just couldn't get to everything. And what he was going to do is of course, appoint 6 men to the Supreme Court who were very favorable of his own policies, and therefore he wouldn't keep getting all these socialistic programs struck down in court. So I think that he had lost a lot of his luster with that. The other thing he tried to do was he had tried to purge members of his own party, Democrats, who had opposed him on some of these policies. He handpicked candidates to run against Democratic members of the Senate and then went into those states and campaigned for the people he had chosen. Of course, that infuriated people. So I think he had lost some of his luster, and unemployment was still so high in 1939 that I think he would have had a great deal. The polls show he would not have been able to run for a third term. But unfortunately, what happened? Well, we had the war emergency all during 1940, and the worse the war got, the better FDR's poll numbers were. Gallup was running polls by then, and you can follow that. That's an interesting study if any of you students ever want to look at the Gallup polls from the late 1930s and 1940s. Thank you. Is there another question?
I was wondering if you were struck doing the research as you were talking. Obviously, it just events of the day echoed, and I mean, even to the point of all of the news articles were about what are they going to wear. We hear that with the presidential candidates and the vice presidential candidates. You know, somehow Sarah Palin's wardrobe was of more interest to the reader, we think, than what the policies were that she was going to be advocating. But as you were, did you anticipate that so many of these policy parallels would be kind of revealed as you were digging through the archives and reading the contemporaneous histories?
I didn't anticipate that there would be so much attention on what women wore. You were talking about Sarah Palin, and you know, as women, women in whether you're in business today or you're in politics or public policy or whatever, I think women just have to try a little harder all the time, and we have to prove ourselves, and that's just a fact. I think you young women will run into that, and we can do that. To quote Kay Orr, who was governor of Nebraska, and she's on the board for Hillsdale College, but when she was governor of Nebraska back in the 80s, she said, in order for a woman to be thought of half as good as a man, she must be able to accomplish twice as much in half the time. Fortunately, this is not difficult. And you really have to do that. We need to be more logical. We need to watch how emotional. I'm a very emotional person, but we have to watch how emotional we get. And it's shocking to see that the attention, even back then, is not on all the good that women can do by freeing up men, or that we can build ships well, or we can learn to rivet. We can learn to do all the things in an office that a man does. And many people were surprised because, of course, with the WACs, there were actually fewer discipline problems than there were with the male soldiers. And they began a record that was really exemplary. And you would be amazed. There's a large series of books on the history of the United States in World War II. One of them that Bert and I looked at extensively for FDR Goes to War is actually the history of the funding of World War II. Now, I'm telling you, people don't line up to read that. And it's about that thick. I spent 10 days, 10 solid days in that book going through all the funding for these military programs to understand it better. Well, there's also a volume on the Women's Army Corps. And I was really shocked at the attitudes when women joined the Army and all this talk that WACs were going to do nothing but get pregnant. It really is an amazingly condescending view of women. And actually, I was very impressed with how the Women's Army Corps was set up. First of all, what they needed were officers. So what they did was they went out and they recruited very prestigious women to serve as the early officer corps. The presidents of colleges, the few women executives in business, they culled through those. So they got some very capable women to direct the Women's Officers Corps. And then they started recruiting the enlisted women who were trained by the officers. And they kept very strict records on how many women got pregnant every year because that was of such interest. In 1942, there were about 12,000 WACs altogether, and 19 were discharged because they were pregnant. So 19 out of 12,000. But at times, you could even use that rumor to your advantage. When the government began the atomic bomb project, the Manhattan Project, some of the officers of the Manhattan Project, the men, went out, of course, and started Los Alamos in New Mexico as a top-secret project. Nobody had any idea what they were doing out there. And, of course, you could see hundreds of Army trucks heading into Los Alamos, building it, and eventually tens of thousands of people working out there, and also working in other locations for the Manhattan Project. Well, in New Mexico, the rumor went around that that's where they were putting all those pregnant WACs. So, and the Army just let the rumor go because it was a good cover for the Manhattan Project. So it was a surprise that you run into the same issues still, and it's just we just have to keep proving ourselves.
I wanted to ask you about something Clare Boothe Luce said and what you thought about it. Clare Boothe Luce, for the high school students, is the great conservative leader that we've named our organization after. Our organization promotes conservative women like Anita. But after Clare Boothe Luce elected to Congress during the war, she gave a speech. It was actually at Republican National Convention, I think 1944, and she said, Roosevelt lied us into war. This was a very strong statement. Back then, the politicians were not quite as blunt as they are today. Oh, and ever after, all the left and so many of the left-wing women attacked her like they attack conservative women today. But when I first read that, I thought, that's what my dad always said. My dad was in the Navy during World War II. She said he lied us into war. What do you think of that?
We cover a lot of that in the book. We don't have her exact statement, but I would agree with it. FDR was a master manipulator. And that has been the problem with this huge myth about Franklin Roosevelt. One of the problems with Franklin Roosevelt was if he had an issue to discuss or something that people were really lobbying him for, he would talk to Bridget. And when she came out of the Oval Office, she would think he agreed with her. And then Michelle would talk to him, and Michelle would think he agreed with her. And then I the same, and then any number of you could not pin him down. And if he told you something, it didn't really, his words you could not trust. So in beginning World War II, he would go on the radio and promise American mothers their boys would not be sent overseas. In 1940, he's campaigning for a third term, and he says over and over again, your boys are not going to be sent into any foreign wars. At that time, he was already in communication with Winston Churchill and trying to figure out what we could do to help the British war effort. He was already making plans for American ships to carry war goods to Britain. And there was opposition. Senators such as Robert Taft from Ohio said, what happens when we have war goods that we're carrying to Great Britain and the ship goes down and American soldiers or American sailors are killed? Won't that get us into war? And those kinds of questions needed to be asked. But yes, I would say he definitely, Clare Boothe Luce was right, and she probably had some sources that knew about that.
Hi, Michelle Pecorin. I'm in accounting here at Heritage. One thing that is really a follow-up to what you were just saying is the way FDR had engineered the internment camps for the Japanese. And I was wondering, in your research, you had any feel of what the public opinion was? Was there press? Was there secrecy behind it? Or how did they ever get away with that? It just scares me to death to think about it, if something like that were to happen today.
Yes, we have an entire chapter on FDR's abuses of civil liberties during the war. And one of the most glaring examples is his treatment of the Japanese during World War II. Now, of course, the Japanese are centered mostly on the West Coast. And it's hard to know the hysteria that swept the West Coast after Pearl Harbor. And literally, there were Japanese submarines sailing up and down the West Coast. One Japanese submarine shelled a refinery on the West Coast. And there were a few Japanese planes that flew over the West Coast, not a great many. But so many people out there were concerned that we were facing a Japanese invasion. Of course, that was unfounded. But I believe, and my husband believes, what FDR thought was he saw an opportunity to really win votes in California. And he and the governor of California at that time both wanted to intern the Japanese. Now, even Secretary of War Henry Stimson, who happened to be a Republican and was a very knowledgeable man, and J. Edgar Hoover didn't believe the Japanese posed any threat. He said, our investigations show that they are very patriotic and very law-abiding, and they are good citizens. But the Japanese also really dominated the fruit and vegetable industry in parts of California. And many white Californians wanted them out of there. And so Roosevelt and his cabinet, they themselves passed or came up with the idea of interning the Japanese. Over 100,000 Japanese are relocated. And economically, it pretty much wiped all of them out. They couldn't sell their homes or their cars or their vegetable businesses for anything like full price. And they were relocated to some pretty remote and cold and dusty, often, locations. And that is a really sad chapter in American history. And I will say, FDR kept them there. His cabinet in 1944, the war was going so well, 2 years later, that FDR's cabinet was lobbying him to let the Japanese go back to their homes. And he wouldn't do it until a week after he won election to a fourth term. And he won California. See, he won that fourth term, and then a week later, the Japanese are out.
One up here.
I'm Donna Moore, and I worked for Family Research Council, but way back in the day, I actually worked under J. Edgar Hoover at the FBI, and we did get those memos that we were supposed to wear dresses. Mm-hmm. I'd like to ask, when I went to school, in high school, I learned that it was FDR's New Deal that got us out of the Depression. And I was actually shocked later to hear the notion that it was the war. So do you address that in your book at all? Do you talk about the New Deal and the war actually getting us out of the Depression?
Yes, thank you for that question. We actually end the book with an analysis of what did get us out of the Great Depression. And we don't really believe it was the war. When you take 12 to 14 million men and you take them out of society and you put them into the military, you haven't created jobs. you have simply created a huge military machine. Now, we did that to win the war, but the other thing we did was we went hugely into debt. The U.S. debt went from about $20 billion to, by the end of the war, our yearly payments were $20 billion interest on the national debt, and we had 12 to 14 million men in the military. What we feel ended the Great Depression was at the end of the war, it was a series of things that happened. Number one, it is amazing still when you read the accounts of the Manhattan Project and how successful that was in keeping atomic research secret. When those bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945, very few people really knew the full extent of how damaging those bombs could be. And the bombs convinced the Japanese, convinced the emperor that he must end the war. The war ended very suddenly on August 14th, and Congress was actually out of session. All those bureaucrats that Congress would have put into operation, Congress had thought that, and the New Dealers and Franklin Roosevelt, although Franklin Roosevelt had died in April of 45, they thought the war would last at least into 1946, maybe the end of 46, maybe even 47, if we had to fight a conventional war against Japan. But when the bombs were dropped, the bureaucrats weren't ready. They didn't have a plan for what to do after the war. And there were enough congressmen, enough senators who said, we've had it with these high taxes. We've had it with all this regulation. We are going to stop that. And they began to cut taxes. There was a big argument about it on Capitol Hill. And I would like to say to all of you young people, when you hear all these predictions about doom and gloom and these awful effects that something is going to have, take the time to really investigate and look at the facts, because so often it's just scare tactics. One congressman said he thought we'd have 18 million unemployed in 1946. Well, Congress cut taxes, they slashed regulations, and millions of men were coming home from the war. So you have more men going out looking for jobs. And what's going to happen to the economy? When the taxes were slashed and regulations lowered, we had instead an economic boom. And by 1946, unemployment is still only 3.9%. 1947 is 3.9%. And we feel that this really did end the Great Depression.
What a great talk. What a great book. We have some gifts for you here.